Okay, let's begin. So, welcome to this program on how to bring your best self to to difficult conversations and difficult relationships. My name is David Lee. So, what prompted this, what prompted this webinar was a comment from a coaching client who was feeling justifiably frustrated with some of her colleagues who weren't keeping their commitments, didn't show the same level of professionalism that she had, and she needed to have conversations with them, but she also was really clear that she didn't want to show up as a jerk. She actually used a different word, but we'll use jerk. And so that's a big challenge when, especially not just if we find somebody difficult or it's a difficult conversation, but when we feel like we're in the right. And how do we bring up the issue in a way that doesn't trigger defensiveness or antagonism? So that's what we'll explore. So this is actually an excerpt from the full day program, Let's Talk for a Change, sometimes known as Better Results Through Better Conversations. Okay, so here are the two most important moments of truth when you have an important conversation. One is what you do before the conversation, and then number two is how you start off the conversation. Mastering these two moments of truth will make or break the conversation. So in this webinar, we're going to focus on what you do before the conversation. In past webinars, we've talked about the starting off the conversation. So let's talk about why. Now, obviously, you think it's important or you wouldn't be here, but I want to make sure you appreciate at a deeper level the importance of practicing the material that we talk about, because there's a whole different level of commitment difference between attending a webinar and actually reviewing the material later, applying the material later. And so obviously I want you to do more than just attend this webinar. So why is it so important to get good at the before moment of truth? Well, number one, I'm just going to quickly check to see if there's any questions. No, we're good to go. Okay. So number one, our emotional state affects our cognitive functioning and performance. So if we're angry, if we're upset, obviously we don't think as rationally and we don't perform as well. And perform as well can be having the conversation, but just in general. If we're stressed out, if we're upset, we don't perform as well. And that's why elite athletes and elite performers in all fields are very disciplined about engaging in practices that enable them to be at an optimal state. Number two, our self-talk and our beliefs determine our mental state and profoundly influence our emotional state. So what we tell ourselves about the other person, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, and the beliefs we have about the other person affect our mental state and have a huge impact on how we feel. So I'll just give you one quick for instance. So if we believe somebody said something to us, the purpose of why somebody said something to us was to get back at us or to be mean or passive aggressive. If we have those kinds of beliefs, that will definitely affect our emotional state very differently than if we believe they were just not thinking when they said whatever they said. And so we want to be alert and able to examine our self-talk and our beliefs. Number three, the state we're in mentally and emotionally shapes how we perceive a situation and therefore how we deal with it. So again, if we have that sort of belief I mentioned earlier, or if we're upset, or I should say, or we're really upset, that dramatically influences how we think about the other person, the situation that happened, and then the upcoming conversation. And you've experienced that when you've been really angry at somebody and you knew enough not to immediately talk to them about whatever it is that you're angry about, because you knew that's coloring how you see it and then how you'll deal with it. And number four, we want to get good at the before moment of truth, before the conversation moment of truth, because our state will affect the other person's state. So if we're angry, if we're feeling combative, then the other person will pick up on that. And there's something called mirror neurons in the prefrontal lobe of human beings, and mirror neurons end up reacting to other people's nonverbal expressions of their emotional states and then creating that emotional state in us. And obviously the same things happens with another person. So that's one of the roots of emotional contagion, how somebody's bad mood can be transferred to other people. So we want to do the work ahead of time so we're not in an angry, resentful, negative emotional state, because if we are, we'll transfer it to them. And then last but not least, because how we start off the conversation will largely determine our success, we want to make sure we show up in an optimal state and come up with a great opener. So doing the work in the before you have the conversation moment of truth not only helps shift you out of a negative emotional state, so you're in the optimal emotional state to have a productive conversation, number one, but also doing the work ahead of time helps you come up with your opening remarks, if you will, or what I call the declaration invitation. So you declare this is what you want to talk about, and then you invite the person into a conversation. So that's why it's worth working with this material and learning more about it later. So, and that's why one of my favorite slogans when either coaching or teaching about constructive conversations is what you do before the conversation profoundly affects how the conversation goes. Okay, so let's talk about what to do before the conversation. I'll do a quick check here. Just want to check questions. Any questions? No, we're good. Okay. So what I try to do here in our 29-minute or less webinar is, if you think about the full program as a buffet table of all these yummy goodies, is to select a few of the most useful practices and principles out of those. So we've got a few items from the full buffet table. So number one, here are two thinking errors to pay attention to and challenge. Number one, mind reading and negative attribution. Number two, fortune telling and catastrophizing. So actually there are really four, but those two are related, the top two and the bottom two. So mind reading and negative attribution. It's when we tell ourselves we know they said or did whatever it is they said or did because of some negative motive or some negative aspect of their character. So, oh, I know Sally said that because she's angry at me because I challenged her idea earlier in the meeting. Or Bill's doing that because he's passive aggressive. So we tell ourselves we know why they did or said what they did, and or we attribute their actions to some inherent flaw or dysfunction. And just an FYI, I encourage you to Google fundamental attribution error, and you'll come across some really interesting research on how, unfortunately, it's part of human nature to attribute bad behavior on other people's part by some fundamental personality flaw or character flaw, but we tend to attribute our bad behavior to a situational variable, like we're tired or we're under stress. The big picture with mind reading and negative attribution is that we don't want to buy our belief, we don't want to buy our guess as to why the person is doing or saying what they're doing as the truth or see it as a fact. We need to see it as an opinion or an interpretation. So that's where we want to be good at challenging mind reading and negative attribution. So how do we do that? Number one, noticing. Whenever you say, oh, I know they're doing that because, or we notice yourself telling yourself stories about the other person and why they're doing what they're doing. And then remind yourself, I'm making this up. I might be right and I might be totally wrong. Because think about, you've undoubtedly, unless you're perfect, you've had experiences where you, quote, knew where somebody was coming from. And let's say an email, you got an email that had an attitude, that at least you thought it that way, it did. But then when you checked out with the person, they're like, no, I just whipped it off, on my iPhone running to my meeting. Like, oh, okay. So we've all had experiences where we thought uh, somebody was coming from a negative intention, and it turns out they weren't. Now, there's nothing wrong with trying to make sense out of where a person was coming from. Like, it seems like they're angry at me, or it seems like they're being passive aggressive. The problem is when we confuse our guess with the truth. So here's a variation of a really great question that I heard from the folks from Vital Smarts. And it's the decent person litmus test, sort of. It's, why might a normal, reasonable, honorable person say or do that? So notice, by asking that question, it brings you in a whole different direction. It's like you search in a whole different mental folder than if you say to yourself, here's why they're doing this. It's because they're a bad person, they're unprofessional, they're a loser, whatever. By asking that question, like, why would somebody I respect and care about, why would a, quote, normal person do that? It helps you come up with different attributions for the behavior. Okay, let's move on to fortune telling and catastrophizing. So that's predicting some bad future occurrence and then acting like it's a fact rather than an imaginary future reality that we just created, and then, to make matters worse, feeling upset about it ahead of time. You think about how crazy, it's just like worrying, that all worrying is making us upset about something that hasn't even happened. So it's sort of like, even if it does eventually happen, we're extending the misery period. So there's nothing wrong. In fact, I highly recommend thinking strategically and doing like scenario planning. So they might respond this way. Okay, how will I respond? They might respond this way. Response A, response B. Here's how I'll respond if they do B. The difference between fortune telling and catastrophizing is when you're doing sort of like potential scenario-based planning, you're not being emotionally affected by it. You're being very thoughtful and rational. You're also not convincing yourself that you know what's going to happen. That's fortune telling. So hopefully that difference makes sense. So how do you challenge fortune telling and catastrophizing? So just a FYI, these mind reading and negative attribution and fortune telling and catastrophizing are two of the most common ways we stress ourselves out and we make ourselves miserable. And I've been working in the resilience field for over 30 years now, and knowing how to identify cognitive errors and challenge unproductive self-talk has been, for me, the most useful material and protocols, practices for not stressing myself out. And it's a lifetime practice. You don't just learn this once or multiple times and apply it all the time. It requires review. It requires conscious application. And if you're interested, you could just Google Dr. Aaron Beck or Dr. David Burns, or their classic book, Feeling Good, The New Mood Therapy. And you can come across the other cognitive errors that they talk about. Okay, so to challenge, number one, notice when you're doing it. Number two, remind yourself, I'm making this up. I might be right, this might happen, or I might be totally wrong. So just like with a fortune telling. And then remind yourself, all this does is make me angrier or more stressed out. So let's get a grip and focus on how I want to bring this up. So shifting your attention from these like Stephen King horror movies of the catastrophe that'll happen if you do bring it up, to more productive use of your time, which is strategizing, how am I going to bring this up, your declaration invitation. Okay, so next tactic is to notice and challenge self-righteous outrage. And also, seeing this guy reminds me, I meant to mention earlier, to please be thinking about somebody who really gets under your skin and you need to have a productive conversation with. So you'll be thinking more about how this applies to you. So here's the deal with self-righteous outrage. To remind yourself, while I might be justified in feeling this way, and I might be right in my belief that people shouldn't act that way, he or she did, and being upset only hurts me, so I'm going to focus my attention on shifting my emotional state. And then you can also add to that, shift my attention to coming up with an effective declaration invitation. So in challenging unproductive self-talk and unproductive beliefs, that doesn't mean trying to convince yourself that unacceptable behavior is acceptable. It just means not dwelling on it and not getting attached to the drama in your righteousness. And I know that can be hard when you feel very right in your position, and you are very right in your position. It doesn't do us any good. It's like that saying about resentment. Holding resentment towards somebody is like drinking poison, thinking it's going to kill somebody else. So we need to do our work about noticing and challenging self-righteous outrage. I think I see a question here. Just want to check. Oh, no? Okay, no questions. We'll go back. Okay. Excuse me. So those are the three things to notice and change. Let's move on to guiding principles for an effective before the conversation moment of truth. So here's some principles that I find really helpful. Number one is get curious, not furious. I heard this from Mel Silberman. Don't know if he made it up or heard it from somebody else, but I love this. He said, people with high levels of emotional intelligence, when they deal with difficult people, they get curious, not furious. Now, oftentimes, I'll get furious, just as you do. And I will remind myself, get curious, not furious. So it helps me shift out of that furious state, because we can't be curious and furious at the same time. Okay. Oh, here we go. Here's a question. Can we get a hard copy of this presentation? Yes, you can, John. In fact, sorry, thanks for asking that. Forgot to mention that. I just before we went on, I created a handout that has all these points. Sorry about that. And also I'm recording it so you can review it also if you want it, and you're welcome to share it with people. So thanks. Sorry, I forgot to mention that in the beginning. Okay. Assume innocence or ignorance rather than evil intent. I continue to work with that, remind myself of that. And so instead, it's sort of another strategy to fight mind reading. So one of the things that I think about is when somebody acts or speaks in a thoughtless way, they're literally without thought, very, very possibly. They opened their mouth and said something without thinking about it. And again, if you think about your own experience where somebody said something that you, quote, took the wrong way, you challenged them, and they're like, no, I didn't mean it that way. So we've all had experiences of that, or people have accused us of some sort of malicious intent. We're like, no. So having as our default position, they probably didn't mean it the way I'm instantly interpreting. And I will find out. I will ask them. Remember the law of reciprocity and act accordingly. So a really fascinating book, Influence, the Science of Persuasion by Dr. Robert Cialdini. He talks about principles of human nature as they relate to our ability to influence others. And he talks about how human beings are hardwired for reciprocity. So in other words, when somebody does something nice for you, you want to do something nice for back. If somebody comes at you clearly trying to show you that you're wrong and they're right, then you're probably going to reciprocate. And so one of the things that I try to think of in the before moment of truth is the law of reciprocity, and to ask myself, is this how I would want somebody to approach the issue with me? So kind of the golden rule. And the other is, if I approach the person the way I'm thinking, how will they likely reciprocate? And is that what I want? So if I go in, both barrels blazing and very self-righteous and want to show them why they screwed up, they're probably going to act accordingly. If I go in in a sense, or with a sense of goodwill and willingness to hear their point of view, they're probably going to do the same. So that's really helped me at times get a grip and dial down the intensity or the aggression level of how I bring up the issue, or think about bringing up the issue, because we're talking about the before moment of truth. Add the right mix of courage and kindness. So courage is speaking your truth, saying what needs to be said, and the kindness is not using a hammer when just a light touch will work. It's like that Geico commercial, if you ever heard, where they quote an ancient Chinese proverb, "Don't use a hatchet to remove the fly from your friend's forehead." That's a bit overkill, and some people are really good with the courage. They're very direct, and they talk about what needs to be talked about, but they don't have a whole lot of kindness, and so people feel bludgeoned or bullied. Other people are great with the kindness, but they need to dial up the courage. So kind of maybe get a sense of where you are in this. And I also use these two variables when I think about my declaration invitation. So in the before moment of truth, when I'm planning what I'm going to say, I ask, is this an appropriate mix of courage and kindness? Okay, here's some questions to ask before you have the conversation. Do I have any of these counterproductive intentions? So especially if you've got some person in mind and you're thinking about having a conversation with them, ask yourself if any of these sound hauntingly familiar. Is my goal to make them wrong rather, and show them I'm right? I've certainly had that and had to work on changing that. Is my goal to judge, scold, or instruct them? So I turn myself into their unsolicited coach. Is my goal to pay them back, to punish them by making them squirm? When I do the program on this, I use a conversation that I had with a verbally abusive coworker years ago as sort of the model for this, as the framework for the model that I use. And I often confess to how my first goal when I was thinking about having the conversation was to get him to squirm, for him to feel some of the pain that I felt when he said the things that he said to me. Obviously not a productive intention. And then also asking, is your goal to get them to change their basic personality? Probably not going to happen. A couple other questions to ask. Will the approach I'm considering help them feel emotionally safe? If you can stop and just imagine flashing lights and that, like, bing, 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 that kind of noise in the background going off, because this is key. Your ability to create an emotionally safe environment for other people to talk makes all the difference in the world in your ability to engage people in productive conversations around difficult issues. So any and all work you do to get good at this will make a huge difference in your life. Asking, am I being kind? Ask, am I wimping out? Okay, so two questions to get to the courage and kindness dimensions. And here's one I love. Would I be proud if, and then pick somebody you really respect, if that person watched me interact with the person I'm going to have the conversation with in the way that I'm thinking of? And so one of the things that I do with a friend that I have huge respect for, a couple of things. One is I will run by her how I'm thinking of bringing up the conversation. And also, if it's an email message, I will run the email by her to make sure that the email is neutral and respectful. It doesn't have emotionally charged words or phrases, and that it's an appropriate use of email to introduce a topic. And that's a whole webinar on its own. But the key is, if you wouldn't be proud of that person you respect witnessing what you're doing, then it's a pretty good idea that you're not bringing your optimal self there. And then here's a question I love. What action on my part is for the highest good? So even if I don't particularly like this person and I don't intend on having a relationship with them after this conversation, so I'm not trying to refurbish a relationship or restore or get it back on track. But if I feel like having this conversation and modeling a respectful way of dealing with a difficult issue might reverberate through their life, it might be a good role, I might be hopefully a good role model, that's for the highest good. And so that's another question you can ask that helps bring out your highest self, your optimal self. So last but not least, we're on the home stretch here. Actions to take that will increase the likelihood of success. Vent and process as much as you need to get into a productive state. So those close friends that you need to get out of that anger, that resentment, whatever. Get a respected third party's perspective. Doesn't have to be a coach. It could be somebody that you feel like is at least, if not more, evolved than you are. You don't want some, hardcore Neanderthal friend who's like, yeah, give it to him good. Yeah, you tell him what's what. It's the last thing you need. Okay, number 3, practice your declaration invitation. Remember, that's the opener, and get feedback on it. And I will send you out a link to a resource page which has articles I've done on the declaration invitation if you haven't been to that webinar. And look for opportunities to engage the person in neutral or positive interactions, not in a manipulative way, but simply in a way to show goodwill, to help them begin to associate positive feelings with you and not negative feelings. Because if you have a history of negative interactions with that person, just seeing you, just hearing your voice triggers a negative emotional state in them, just like they do that with you. I mean, haven't you had that experience? You just hear that person's voice and you start to feel, defensive or antagonistic. So finding opportunities to be kind to them, to be thoughtful, just some sort of low-key conversation can help you begin to create positive associations. So to summarize, we talked about 2 thinking errors to notice and challenge. There are actually 4, but they were combined into 2 sets. Noticing and challenging self-righteous outrage, even if it's justified. Questions to ask ahead of time. Remember, all this is on your handouts. And actions you can take between now and when you have the conversation. And even just in general, these are actions you can take to cultivate and strengthen that challenging relationship. So again, this is excerpts from the Let's Talk from a Change webinar, seminar, sorry. And I'm going to open up the questions here. I'm officially ended in just a few seconds below or before 29 minutes as I promised. So we are officially ended, but those of you who have questions, I will stay on to answer. But just in winding up before anybody has any questions, just to say I'll be sending you out. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send you out a link to just a super quick feedback survey, because I don't want to just be sending this out into the ether and not knowing if it's useful, how to make it more useful, etc. And then once you fill out the super short survey, you'll get a link to download the handouts and also some extra resources to build on what we covered.